K9 dog found a Navy SEAL dying when he acted and stunned the entire SEAL force. The jungle didn't roar after the blast, it held its breath. Chief Petty Officer Lucas Kane lay half swallowed by a ravine, ribs grinding, left arm dead weight tasting metal and wet soil. His radio showed a spider web of cracks, his beacon a mute red eye. Above him, cicadas stalled, as if the canopy listened for a name it couldn't remember. The training cadre shouted grid numbers, confident they knew where every man was. They did near the rope perimeter. A scarred gray dog raised his head. The teams called him Ghost because the paperwork didn't. He knew the rhythms of this place when boots thumped, when thunder stitched, when fear thinned a man's breath to a thread. Tonight the pattern slipped. He slid under canvas and wire, a whisper with pause. Corpsman Elias Holt, sweat running salt into his eyes, saw the blur and dismissed it. Strays chase echoes. He returned to counting tourniquets, pretending the rain wasn't coming in sideways. Kane blinked mud out of his lashes. The jungle smelled of rot and iodine, green and old. He wedged 2 fingers into a root to keep from fading. Somewhere water moved, not the ocean, something close, a trickle that stopped, then started like someone drinking. Ghost halted on a ledge, nose lifted, body tight. He didn't look back for permission, none was coming. He stepped into the dark that crumbled and kept going. Before we reveal how it unfolded, subscribe with notifications on and comment where you're watching from. This wasn't luck, it was loyalty. A cold nose found Kane's wrist. A breath, steady, intentional, warmed his palm. Far above, radios argued about the wrong hillside. Down here, a forgotten dog made a choice. He lowered his weight, signaling a path Kane couldn't see yet through the vines. What happened next will shock you. Canvas barriers drooped between jungle poles. Chem lights clipped to paracord, tracing a rectangle around tents, a comms table, and sweating crates. Cicadas buzzed like tiny motors, and the clearing smelled of salt drift, iodine, diesel, and leaf rot. The temporary SEAL compound looked borrowed, its edges fraying into thick vines and ferns. Chief Petty Officer Lucas Kane walked the lanes at dawn, the routine check that kept corners honest. Scan, signal, count exits, trust habit but expect it to fail. The dog most men ignored had arrived 6 months earlier, trailing a convoy along the fishing road. Gray, scarred, sinewy, he carried the hush of training. He did not crowd food or bark at generators. He watched hands, yielded doors, and slept where 2 paths met. No tag, no file. The teams called him Ghost because the paperwork did not. Somewhere, a handler was gone, or a kennel lost track during redeploy. The animal wore memory like a vest. He paced beside morning PT without joining formation, turned his head at finger signals, refused touch without showing fear, and slept with ears that sorted rain from footfall. Elias Holt, the corpsman, distrusted variables with teeth. At the med canopy, he inventoried supplies like prayer, then did it again. Tourniquets rolled tight, gauze stacked. IV lines flaked straight, analgesics counted against the manifest. He noticed Ghost the way he noticed weather and terrain, as background risk. Clever dogs help until they do not, he told himself, and the worst time to learn the difference is during a casualty. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, senior enlisted for the exercise, moved like he owned gravity. He plotted routes by water behavior, checked ropes by feel, and corrected posture with a raised eyebrow. Men believed him because he did not guess. He measured. The 3-day combat simulation stacked the difficult. Day 1 forced movement through swampy cutbacks under canopy with false markers that punished lazy bearings. Day 2 layered observation posts, stealth breaches, and staged contacts using blanks and thunder flashes that shook ribs. Day 3 braided everything, recon a string of buried training charges and place inert timers, exfil fast. Then handle surprise, injects demanding triage under simulated indirect fire. Training ordnance was commercial stock meant to cue rather than maim. Sealed cylinders with timers and pressure plates that instructors inspected twice. By late morning, a squall came off the water and smeared the light. Rain hammered tarps until they bowed, and the clearing turned to slick clay. Trails down to the eastern lane, filled with roots, braided old plantation terraces. The smell sharpened, green over salt, wrought over diesel. Cole shifted a checkpoint upslope to avoid a week-old sinkhole, warned about an undermined bench cut near a ravine mouth, and reminded Cadre that saturated terraces collapse sideways for their own reasons. Kane's element moved across the sector like a steady metronome. They ghosted between buttressed trunks, skirted thorn mats, and settled above a flagged stake that marked a training device half buried in mud. Kane gave a two-finger halt, scanned the cut, clocked egress, and signaled his number 2 to anchor rear secure. Holt listened to the net from under canvas, hearing calm traffic and the rhythm of call signs and grid updates. Ghost dozed beside a comms crate, chin on paws, one ear cocked toward the lanes like a tuned antenna that no one else possessed. The soil looked solid. It was weeks of rain had turned sublayers to slurry beneath a thin crust. The terrace edge held the weight of still men and then transmitted change like a wave when one boot pivoted. Inside the cylinder, a pressure plate sat a shade out of true despite inspection. Moisture, vibration and time conspired. Either the plate clicked early, or the bank, already undermined, chose that second to fail. Kane shifted to warn his number 2 back from exposed roots. A squib coughed, the crust slumped, trading shape for flow. He tried to ride the slide and the bank betrayed him anyway. He dropped with the soil, catching a buried limb with his left forearm. Shock stung from wrist to shoulder and set knives between ribs. He hit a tangle of roots and rocks that had been good neighbors until the hillside told them to move. His radio slammed a stone and spiderweb, his beacon light glowed without voice, and his world funneled to the sound of water and the thin grind of breath. Above, his team froze, checked fire by reflex and called range. The ravine answered with echo and rain. Depth turned into guesswork. Kane pulled himself small and counted breath the way men count seconds to keep fear from finding speed. Water trickled nearby, stuttering as if slowed by debris. He fixed on the sound because sounds map spaces when sight fails. At the perimeter, ghosts, the change that ran through the ground ran through him. He shook rain from his coat, lifted his nose and stared not at men but at the dark wedge of trees where the eastern lane fell away. He stepped under the rope, without looking for permission, a gray shadow with purpose, choosing roots over bare clay and the tight line where the slope held. Holt saw him go. Rain ran off the brim of his cap into his lash. He told himself the dog chased thunder, or crab sense, and forced his focus back to numbers with a pinch of annoyance at distraction, stacking tourniquets, checking adjuncts, and speaking into the radio in a voice trimmed to routine. Cole did not see the dog. Cole saw the slope. He trimmed chatter to essentials and sent a cadre pair toward Kane's last vector with instructions to follow water, not map lines. He asked for a triangulation ping, knowing foliage would choke it, and marked 3 likely ravine mouths, picking the one that would collect a man pushed by a slot. He set the litter team on the line that would bear weight under 4 bodies and a stretcher, and he let terrain, not fear, set the clock. The ravine wore vines like a curtain. Inside it smelled of bruised greenery and iron. Ghost paused at the lip, listening with his whole body, then eased onto a tilted shelf. He tested mud with each paw, backed off where the ground sheared, and angled down to catch purchase where roots braided a ledge. Rain blew sideways in white sheets and hissed where it met leaves. The jungle took back the compound's noise with every step he made. Kane catalogued himself as if writing a note, forearm compromised but usable, ribs likely cracked, head clear, spine angry without lightning, bleeding manageable if motion stayed small, breathe shallow, mouth met. Radio ritual without response. He pressed 2 fingers into a root to anchor against sliding deeper. Back at the clearing, Holt organized the litter team and forced calm into his voice until it sounded like routine. He glanced once more at the tree line where Ghost had vanished and told himself the animal would circle back when the storm eased. Cole led the movement off the perimeter, with a pace that wasted nothing, signaled a halt where clay brightened with fresh shear, and adjusted the line again by the way water pooled at the base of trunks. Ghost reached the first terrace break and stopped, ears pinned, tail low. Scents layered, salt off skin, cordite echo, wet bark, disturbed earth, the metallic bite of blood. He drew a map from air and water, stepped again lower, slower, then lifted his head and listened for a breath thin enough to hide under insects. What he heard turned his path into a straight line. He slid deeper, vanished into green, and the rope behind him swayed once and went still. Holt still dismissed it reluctantly. Rain stitched the canopy into a single wet roof while Ghost moved as if the ground spoke to him in breaths and echoes. He lowered his weight for every step, testing shelves with a claw, pausing where clay trembled, choosing roots over glare-slick mud. Vines brushed his ribs, thorn tips combed old scars, water beaded his whiskers and fell in tiny drops he ignored. He stopped, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it, the small hollow where cicadas paused and a human breath tried to hide. Left, then down, then a quick backtrack when the slope sheared. He mapped scent and pressure in the way water pulled toward a pocket. Above, the compound traded morning routine for a disciplined scramble. Radios popped. A laminated map bled ink under rain. A generator coughed and caught. Elias Holt ran the medic net with a calm voice that cost effort, eyes cutting to the tree line against his will. He remembered the gray dog who never begged. The way Ghost turned at a two-finger signal no one had meant to give him. The way thunder never owned his attention. He told himself the animal would circle back and still felt the itch that comes before a decision you did not plan to make. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole built a search the way a bridge builder sets beams. He stripped chatter, broke teams into pairs with clean tasks, and set pace by terrain instead of hope. Follow water, not paint, he said, and pointed men toward the line the hillside preferred. Lucas Kane lay folded into a ravine notch with his left arm dissolving into ache and his ribs drawing a short line inside his chest. He took shallow breaths that did not convince his blood. The taste in his mouth was metal and green. He pressed his fingertips into a knotted root to keep from sliding and let the jungle talk to him so fear would not. He counted heartbeats to make minutes and pretended the number would be honored by rain and dirt. A pebble skittered above him. He did not look, sight lay in wet dark. Ghost nosed the air and took the pebble's report apart, separating gravity from panic. He inched across a narrow bench, belly close, claws whispering lines that held. He paused, ears forward, and the world separated into layers. Water thread, leaf gas, faint cordite, a salt note that did not belong to the sea. He lowered his head and exhaled, drawing what he needed from the humid mix. He angled right, hopped to a root braid, felt it flex and hold, then took 2 soft steps and stopped again. At the perimeter, Holt checked litter straps and traction splints with hands that had repeated these motions until they could do them under blackout cloth. He kept seeing Ghost stretched in the shade near demo pits, days before, eyes on the lane while charges thumped and men flinched, unblinking in a way that suggested training instead of temperament. Other strays asked, "This one stud." Holt disliked the conclusion because it tied the dog to a missing file and a dead handler, and no one needed that in the middle of a storm. He pushed it away, keyed his radio, and kept the net tidy. Cole walked the line, listening to water instead of men. He marked where runoff cut the bank, and where roots stitched better footing. He trimmed instructions until even fear could memorize them. The jungle offered 3 bad choices. He picked the one that would not collapse under 4 bodies and a stretcher, and tasted blood thinner than before, and told himself that meant something good. He imagined boots on mud, canvas snapping, coffee burning under a tarp. None of those sounds reached. What he heard was a small shift, then stillness, then another shift that did not slide afterward, a pattern that felt like patience. Ghost drifted into view like a moving shadow. A cold nose touched Kane's wrist and left. Kane whispered without words, saving air. Ghost pressed his shoulder along Kane's ribs, not heavy, anchoring the man to the slope while breath found a shorter path. Then he climbed 3 steps and pawed a fern, leaving it skewed as a silent arrow. He moved to a second shelf and scraped twice, just enough to make a sign without making noise. He returned to warmth duty and matched Kane's breathing until it steadied. Cole's flank pair reported a tiny beacon pulse, the kind you get when canopy eats a signal and spits back a fraction. Cole triangulated with terrain, not strength bars, and nudged the axis 5 degrees. "Follow water, not paint," he repeated, and sent the litter team into the trees at knee height to lower the weight on the soil. Holt entered the fringe and saw the first scuff Ghost had left in clay where he had tested and refused a root. The mark was too neat for an accident. Holt crouched over it, rain sewing his sleeves to his arm, and admitted the memory that had been needling him all morning. Ghost moving when a tray crashed at chow, not spooked, not hungry, just choosing a safer angle. Ghost pausing outside a tent until a man stepped aside. Ghost watching, hands not face. He stood up with a headshake that flung water and skepticism away and moved. Ghost set a third mark, a vertical scratch on bark that would not wash off. He lifted his head, listening for boots, and held still. He did not bark, noise mattered. So did Holt's headlamp finally caught gray fur against green. He froze. Ghost did not flinch. He slid sideways, just enough to show a path, then lay across the edge of the shelf to block a slide. Holt eased forward on his stomach, forearm braced, and felt the earth shrug under him. Then he reached into the wet dark and found Kane's hand. Pressure, confirmation, work. Have you ever trusted a gut feeling that others ignored? Share in the comments. Cole kept the rest of the line quiet and slow. He passed directions in 2-sentence packets. He measured risk in paces and slope angles, not in volume. The beacons still argued with leaves. The radios still tried to make rules for rain. The only map that worked belonged to a gray animal who had chosen a job no one had assigned. Kane saved words for what mattered. Good, he said once, and let the sound be his acknowledgement that he was still here. Holt checked breath sounds with a hand, not a stethoscope, because the jungle had taken flat surfaces hostage. He counted ribs with fingertips, felt the hitch that meant fracture, saw the arm swelling, and filed every detail into the plan forming behind his eyes. Ghost watched his hands and shifted an inch when Holt needed space. He seemed to understand where the weight would slide and where it would anchor. Holt hated that he was relieved by this and kept working. Cole signaled the litter team to stage 2 shelves up. They would not bring weight down until the path accepted. He sent the flank pair to cut back brush along the exit line, and had them mark route crossings with webbing strips so boots would know where to land without thought. Ghost nosed Kane's forearm again and then stepped away, climbing to the scratch on the bark, touching it with his paw, then looking back. It was as close to language as a dog could get. He keyed his radio and kept his voice spare. Visual on Kane, slope unstable, signs marked by the dog, hold at staging. Cole answered with a single word and a pause that meant continue. Kane closed his eyes while rain needled the skin above them, and let the pressure of Ghost's body stand in for the team he could not see. He pictured the exit line as a set of small tests, one shelf, then a root seam, then a narrow dip where water wanted to turn feet sideways. He could almost hear Cole counting them under his breath the way some men count leaves shed cold water from high to low, vines swung once and went still. An unseen bird called and then decided not to repeat itself. Ghost's ears ticked at the smallest of those changes and then flattened again. Everything about him signaled patience carved out of urgency. Holt slid closer, wedged himself beside Kane without stealing the angle that kept breathing possible, and let his mind split into 2 lanes, one for care, one for movement. He set a sling for the arm without jostling the ribs. He whispered status up the line, because sound behaves better when you treat it with respect. Cole relayed with the same economy. Ghost held the edge, a gray gate that would not permit panic to end. Rain hammered the leaves, the ravine breathed, and the path from danger to hands became visible in small stubborn pieces. The ravine kept its own weather, a stale pocket under leaning rock where thorns stitched shadows and wet stone breathed. Ghost eased down the broken bank in patient inches, testing each shelf with a claw, easing back whenever clay trembled, then trying again with lower weight. Humidity turned his coat heavy, water beaded on whiskers and fell without notice as he searched with nose, ear and paw, sorting metal from leaf, cordite from moss, salt skin from sea spray. The scent he wanted braided all of it, thin yet stubborn, drawn toward a narrow shelf masked by vines. He paused, listened to the hush between raindrops and stepped again, body long and balanced, moving like a gray thread through green. Below, Lucas Kane lay tucked against a root lattice, breath short, left arm cradled wrong, ribs flashing pain with every inhale. Mud slicked his sleeve where blood had thinned, chill threaded under his vest until shiver nipped his spine. The slope wanted him, gravity had patience, the jungle felt willing to keep him if the team failed to ask correctly. He held a root with 2 fingers, jaw tight, counting slowly to trick fear into staying quiet. Something moved above him, not sliding, not stumbling. A gray shape parted leaves, paused, then came onward with the calm of a creature bred to chew. A cold nose touched his wrist, Warm breath washed his palm, weight leaned into his side just enough to pin him safely to the shelf. Kane closed his eyes in brief relief, opened them and studied the animal. Scars mapped old decisions, pads looked tough, posture spoke of drills, thresholds, doorways and rooms cleared by memory. Whoever had trained this dog had taught him to read air, to steady, to offer pressure when words would fail. Good, Kane rasped, tasting copper and rain. The dog flicked an ear, watched Kane's chest, examined the twisted arm, then turned his head toward the vest pocket. He nosed the flap, tugged gently and knocked a half bottle against stone. Plastic creaked, the cap held. Kane reached with his good hand, caught the base and felt the dog steady the roll with his jaw, until the grip set. Water went down like heat, his throat unclenched, the mind sharpened by a fraction. Broken ribs remained, but panic took one step back. Ghost, unnamed yet already a name, shifted up a span, scraped bark with a deliberate vertical line, and returned to Kane's ribs, laying down to share warmth. Heat moved through wet fur into chilled skin, slow and Kane matched breathing to rhythm without meaning to and felt the tremor retreat. The ravine held rock, thorn, algae, and a wet iron tang. Rain ticked across leaves and ran in silver crawls over stone. The air pressed like a firm hand. Up at the perimeter, Elias Holt moved along the tree line, reading the ground, the way a medic reads a vital sheet. A paw print sat in clay with edges neat and exit crisp, not the messy scatter of panic. He crouched, touched the mark, lifted his eyes along the line of travel. Another sign stood on bark where rain would not wash it, one straight scratch at chest height, fresh enough to glisten. Holt's mouth tightened. He had watched the gray stray ignore thunder, watch hands, and turn at two-finger gestures nobody meant to give. Now the pattern drew its. The dog was not wandering, he was documenting. Holt followed, keeping weight on roots and rock, lowering his center whenever shelves whispered. His radio hissed, Cole's voice stayed level, the cadence of order under weather. Hold until we build an exit, copy, Holt answered, and slid again. Below, Ghost's spine formed a wedge against Kane. The match of breath to breath looked less like comfort and more like treatment. Kane saw Holt's silhouette arrive at the lip, a disciplined outline blended with leaves, and let two words slip. With me. The dog did not He pressed harder for a moment, then eased, a metronome of pressure telling a nervous system to stay. Holt dropped onto the angle, elbows and knees finding what the earth would allow, angling right to a knot of roots, then down the last ledge to the shelf. He did not speak for. He checked the airway with a hand, not a device, felt breath on skin, counted beats at the wrist, and filed numbers. The left ribs are likely fractured, forearm compromised at mid-shaft, swelling tracking up, bleeding is controlled at the surface. Shock pending, delayed by contact and pressure. Yes, contact and pressure. The dog, Holt met the animal's eyes and found no plea, only intent, the steady patience of a working partner holding a position, because the world demanded it. Kane, Holt said, voice low, I have you. Breathe easy, we will not rush what cannot be rushed. Kane closed and opened his eyes once, a slow blink of agreement. Holt reached for a sling he could improvise without shifting the torso. The dog shifted with him, an inch here an inch there, making space, when hands needed angles, then closing the gap to return heat. Kane felt the cradle accept weight, felt ribs stop grinding as cloth held the gloom at bay. Water dripped from Holt's sleeve onto the stone and made tiny stars in the mud. Ghost's ear ticked toward the slope above, then settled again, a gatekeeper choosing when to allow sound. Holt studied the trail that had led here, the vertical mark, the clean prints, the refusal gouges where the dog had tested, and declined a line by scratching a small X into clay. This was a systematic search, this was fieldcraft, this was loyalty as a method rather than a move. Kane opened the water again for 2 small sips, then capped and braced the bottle between stones. Color crept back beneath his skin. Holt keyed his mic, visual on Kane, stable for now, slope hostile. The dog indicates the path, hold until I mark egress. Cole acknowledged with a breath, and a single word, nothing else. Rain leaned in harder. The ravine answered with a damp hush that demanded patience. Ghost rose, moved 3 short steps to the scratch on the bark, pressed his paw against it and looked to Holt. That tiny gesture read like a sentence. Holt nodded, then laid an orange tape segment along the safer seam, where roots braided soil into something like a stair. He marked 2 more holds with quick ties, then returned to the shelf. Kane's lips tried a small shape. He trained, he whispered. He remembers, Holt replied. The dog eased back into place alongside Kane and pressed once more, steady as a heartbeat. Heat traveled back and forth. Shiver retreated another step. Holt set a thin pad under the sling to protect skin, then checked the distal pulse. Present, good. He scanned for hidden bleeds and found only scrapes and the constant ooze that Rain turned polite. Time passed without numbers, measured instead by breath and drip and the occasional shift of a thorned stem. The dog smelled Holt's glove, catalogued him, then returned attention to the man on the shelf. Every choice fits the logic of work. He conserved motion, signaled rotes, lent heat and watched hands for intent. Kane followed the dog's slow exhale with his own, and thought of handlers he had known, men who said little because their partners already spoke in posture. The jungle still pressed, but it no longer threatened to swallow. It settled around them like a heavy cloak they would shed in stage. Holt secured the sling, tightened the wrap, and mapped the first move with his eyes. Up one shelf, shift left to the root seam, step onto webbing, wait while the litter team anchors, then pass hands. The dog would lead or follow, whichever kept the path on. Holt looked again at the marks and understood that the animal had anticipated the needs of strangers because the mission required it. He considered what would have happened if the team had trusted only radios and arithmetic. They might have searched the wrong drawer until the light died. They might have arrived at a body instead of a man, making small jokes between shallow breath. You stay with him, Holt said to the dog, half testing, meaning half offering thanks. Ghost lowered his head onto Kane's palm, fingers curled, contact steadied both. The ravine's stink of rot and wet rock did not fade, but its edge dulled. Rain softened, the canopy creaked. Somewhere a frog called like a wet hinge. Kane stared at the dog's scarred ear and mouthed one more word. Stay. Ghost. Holt marked the last hold, keyed the mic and breathed out before speaking, which kept his tone level. Path set, prepare to move on my cat. Then softer, as if the ravine could hear intention and give them a fraction more room, he added the thought no one needed to record but everyone would remember. Loyalty brought us here. Who's been there for you when no one else was? Tell us below. The dog waited, the medic waited, the man on the shelf waited, and the ravine, humid, oppressive, bristling with rock and thorn, held steady long enough for the next breath to matter. Rain smudged the canopy into a moving veil while the ravine held its sour breath and narrow angles. Holt slid into the pocket beside Kane, knees against roots slick as bone, shoulders tight to the wall so his weight would not spur a slide. Ghost adjusted with him at a whisper, easing pressure just enough for Holt to run a palm along the bruised ribs and count the hitch in each inhale. When Holt paused to listen for crackle and depth, the dog returned contact, lending heat to a body that trembled even as discipline tried to hide it. The distant compound had shrunk to blurred shouts and the cough of a generator. Here urgency had to speak softly or the hillside would punish hurry. Kane, I'm Elias Holtz. Stay with me. Breathe slowly, we'll move you clean. Kane's eyes tracked, lucid in a face streaked with mud. Copy. Ghost kept his head near Kane's wrist, watching Holt's hands the way a partner watches a signal. Holt keyed his radio without looking up. Patient, located, airway patent, shallow respirations, mentation intact, he reported. Multiple rib fractures suspected, left forearm closed fracture, mild hypothermia, minimal external bleeding, slope unstable. He clipped the handset back and leaned in until the rain striking his cap sounded like static on a quiet channel. Holt slid 2 fingers under the collar to check the carotid pulse, felt a steady thrum beneath chill skin, then pressed the back of his hand over the mouth to judge heat and moisture. Numbers aligned into a plan. Pain and cold were the enemies. Movement had to be tiny and exact. He peeled mud from the sleeve with controlled patience, exposing swelling tracking under the forearm skin, a wrong angle muted by shock and rain. Ghost backed one pause width, made a crescent of space and dropped his weight again against Kane's flank so the torso would not twist. Holt glanced at the dog and recognized the calm not of a stray but of a worker who had rehearsed these decisions 1,000 times. Good position, he murmured, more to record the pattern than to praise. Kane answered with a breath that tried to be a laugh and turned into a wind. Holt drew a compact splint from his kit, slid the liner like a sled beneath the arm to protect skin, then brought rigid supports into place, watching Kane's eyelids for that telltale flutter that meant he needed to pause. "On your exhale," Holt said. Kane breathed out and the medic molded the splint to fit, tightening straps with careful tension, checking distal pulse between each wrap. Ghost lifted his muzzle to allow the band to pass, then settled again when the strap cleared, as if he had rehearsed this choreography with hands he remembered. Holt finished the last buckle, tested capillary refill, and eased the limb into the sling he had already stayed. The dog shifted pressure back to Kane's ribs with the delicacy of a metronome, steadying breath without forcing it shallow. Rain found new roots down rock and thorn, the air tasted of iron and crushed leaves. Holt sewed an orange ribbon to the neck's safe hold, pressed it flat and tugged to He tapped the radio. "Shelf 1 taped. Route seam at 1 o'clock is sound. We move in stages." Above, the silhouettes of Cole's pair paused like stone carvings, listening for instructions that would not overrule physics. Holt leaned close to Kane. "First lift is a finger's width. We test the ground and your pain. I'll cue you. Ghost will block the slide." Kane blinked once to signal readiness. The first move was a proof. Holt placed one hand on the sternum to keep the torso aligned, braced the other under the splinted forearm, and counted down. On 3, Kane exhaled. Holt lifted a breath's distance. Ghost pushed into Kane's flank, not shoving, not drifting, simply blocking the slide. The shelf accepted the correction without shedding the. Holt eased back, listened to breathing, counted to 5 and let relief pass through like current through a resistor. Felt but controlled. "Good," he said, and the dog's ear ticked as if a logbook had gained an entry. Holt checked the ribs again, slid gauze under the shoulder strap to cushion bone from abrasion, then tucked a thin barrier beneath wet fabric to buy warmth. The dog moved 1 inch to return heat where shivering threatened a mutiny. Holt put a fingertip to Kane's knuckles. Color had improved. "Pain level, manageable," Kane said, a lie measured to the needs of the moment. Holt accepted it the way professionals accept weather, noted and worked around. He marked the second handhold, then spoke into the mic. "Prep for pass up 1 shelf. Maintain line tension. Watch for shearing at the clay lip." He added nothing about the dog that a report format could carry. The proof was in the geometry that refused to fail. Cole answered with a time hack and a reminder to breathe before each movement. Holt breathed. Kane matched him. Ghost's ribcage rose and fell like a metronome for steadiness. The second move asked more. Holt guided the left elbow close, kept the wrist neutral, and rotated the torso a hand's breadth toward the root. Ghost stayed tight to the broken side, nudging only when the angle tempted gravity to meddle. Kane's breath hitched. Holt waded through it and watched the hitch shorten. "We're fine," he said, and Kane grunted agreement that was functional, not bravado. Above, webbing whispered as the litter team tested anchors without loading the system. "He knows where to be," Holt said before he could stop himself. "Feels like he's reading your hands." Kane answered, "Feels like he's reading my lung." The dog blinked slowly, rain beads hanging from whiskers, attention flicking between man and medic with a persistence that never turned frantic. He reached toward the vest pocket, nudged the bottle closer with gentle teeth, and let Kane wet his mouth before the next effort. Time in the ravine moved like thick oil. Holt built the path in small notes. "This shelf holds. That root bites. The vine above the notch hides a hook that will try to steal the litter." He repeated nothing that did not earn a place. Ghost added his own marks where rain would not erase them. A vertical score here, a paw press there, a refusal gouge on a slick ledge they would avoid. Holt felt respect grow in the space between actions, not because the dog was brave, many creatures are, but because he was He keyed the radio again. "Final checks. On my count we pass to staging. Dog remains as counterweight until feet are set." A pause, then the human part of the story that protocols rarely capture, pressed at the back of his teeth. He let it through. "Ever met someone who worked tirelessly without credit? Share their story." He released the key and glanced at Kane, who smiled with one corner of his mouth, as if the message had been addressed to the gray partner more than anyone listening topside. Echoes of measured movements reached them, harness buckles clinking softly, boots finding webbing instead of clay, breath controlled by men who had learned to let training sit in the driver's seat. Holt gave the count. On 1 they prepared. On 2 they set muscles like quiet cables. On 3 they moved an inch and froze to listen for the earth's verdict. Nothing slid. Holt exhaled. Kane followed. Ghost adjusted to keep warmth where shock hunt. The ravine felt less like a mouth and more like a hallway with a door at the far end. Holt's admiration sharpened into a clean, usable thing. He saw the years inside the dog's calm, the invisible repetitions, the doors cleared, the thresholds waited upon, the handler's hands that had once taught this patience. Grief brushed the edge of the thought and kept going. There would be time to name losses later. For now the living required accuracy. Holt checked pulses again, checked cap refill, checked skin, checked the sling, checked the tape, checked his own posture. He let no step rush the next. Above, Cole's silhouette appeared at the lip, eyes searching without intruding. Holt raised one damp hand, palm open, and Cole stopped, understanding that sometimes leadership means staying where you cannot break the geometry. "We're ready for your reach when I call it," Holt said. "Copy," Cole replied, already easing his team into a shape that would fit the route the dog had written. Ghost lifted his head and listened, then settled. The rain slowed from needles to a steady thread. The smells of rotten iron and crushed leaf held constant, but the edge of threat dulled. Kane shifted one finger against the dog's fur, a silent thanks that needed no phrase. Holt caught it and felt the tightness in his chest loosen by a knot. He had seen courage shaped like speed and noise. This was courage shaped like quiet competence, the kind that rarely gets a medal because it never asks for the ceremony. "One more lift," Holt said. Same breath, same He placed his palms, felt Ghost align like a living brace, and began the numbers that would carry them toward hands, rope, and light. Urgency remained, but now it wore respect, and respect was the safest way out. Rain settled into a thin thread, but the air stayed thick while the ravine released the team by inches. Cole set the geometry, 4 carriers on the litter, Holt at the head, Ghost on point. Kane lay strapped and blanketed, ribs bound, left arm immobilized, eyes. Holt kept 2 fingers on the chest strap to feel breathing through nylon and nodded to move. Ghost tested the first shelf with a claw, shifted left when the clay whispered, and scratched a vertical mark on a trunk the rain would not erase. "Follow texture, not color," Cole said, reminding carriers that bark grips while wet clay lies. Boots found the ribbed root. The litter lifted a hand's breadth and slid 3 slow steps. Humidity-soaked uniforms, mosquitoes probed, water beaded on Ghost's whiskers and fell. He nosed a hanging vine aside to open space for the poles, then let it fall into a harmless arc. Holt checked Kane's face for the micro-flinch that precedes dizziness. "You're good," he said. At a slick stone like a wet anvil, Ghost pressed one paw, felt the surface lie, and turned to interlocking roots that climbed around it. He tapped the 3rd rung and waited. Lid carrier stepped their weight low. The rest mirrored. The litter moved as if the earth loaned permission for a fee paid in patience. Cole kept his voice spare. Same spacing. Water in 90. Rain hissed. The jungle accepted the file a meter at a time. A washout waited where storm water had eaten the land. Ghost made a clear X in soft mud, a refusal, then angled upslope to a buttress root bridging the gap. He laid his paw on the root and held. Cole checked span and bite, nodded and grew a handrail from webbing and steel, cross on the bias. "Low and locked," he said. Holt cued Kane, "Exhale on 3. On 3 the carriers advanced, hips toward the slope, toes feeling for the buried rib while the litter stayed level. Ghost lay at the midpoint, a living sightline until all boots were safe. Beyond the crossing the canopy pinched into a tunnel of saplings, pebbles rolled under a thin crust the obvious trough would pancake. Ghost blocked it with his body, then slipped right into uglier ground that promised honesty over speed. Cole mirrored the pivot, eyes on footing, no hero move. Holt slipped a heat pack under the blanket and watched the jawline that announces pain. Kane fixed on Ghost's shoulders and let that rhythm pull him forward in his mind. Every 20 paces Ghost marked a scratch here, a knuckle of scraped bark there, a paw pressed on firm loam, placed high enough to survive the next downpour. The jungle kept offering false promises, flat clay with no structure, stone glazed with algae, vines that tried to trip ankles. Ghost negotiated each by testing, refusing what sighed under his nails and pointing with posture instead of noise. Root seam, right foot, Cole translated once. Momentum returned in careful increments. Holt stayed just above a whisper, breathe steady, skin warm, pain controlled. Kane blinked slowly. Rain seeped. Holt tucked plastic to stop the cold river at the collarbone. A broken terrace tilted up, the direct line tempted shortcuts. Ghost denied them. He stepped onto a slanted ledge, backed off when it sighed, then cut a switchback that lengthened the distance and killed risk. He scratched a dash on the ledger where the step held. Cole slowed the file, heel, then toe. Let the rock say yes. They ascended without slide. At a waist-high shelf woven with thorn, Ghost waited while the lead lowered the litter corner, then nosed the thorn aside so the fabric would not snag. Holt steadied Kane's head through the tilt. Drink? Kane nodded. 2 sips vanished. The cap clicked home. Compound noise bled faint through trees, but their world stayed smaller, defined by the next boot and the next scarred paw. At a notch barely wider than the litter, Ghost judged the rail stable, then lay along the outer edge as a counterweight while the carriers threaded through. Once clear, he trotted to the fork, head high, tail level. Cole's respect turned into doctrine. Hold to his marks, he told the rear pair. If he says no, it's no. A rain burst swelled, then softened. Steam rose from mud and skin. Holt flexed fingers to keep dexterity, watched the pulse at Kane's neck, and let his hand ride the strap to feel breath return after each jolt. You're doing perfectly, he said, fact not flattery. Another hazard offered leverage and betrayal. Ghost placed both forepaws, felt the give, withdrew, and chose a narrow bench under a fallen log. He ducked, measured clearance and waited while the litter cleared with an inch to spare. The bench carried them to a shoulder where wind pushed humid air sideways. The ground firmed, leaves thin, light brightened by one shade. Ghost braked again at a crust of leaves over a sump, circled it, and scratched a ring on the nearest trunk to warn slower eyes. Cole added a strip of orange for later traffic. Before the last ridge, the lane kinked around a boulder slick as glass and fell away into a V of mud chewed by runoff. Ghost tested the inside wall, rejected it, then angled to a seam where 2 roots stitched the bank like suture. He stamped a short line above the seam, then waited until the front pair set heels exactly there. The litter dipped. Holt caught the tilt with his forearm and breathed Kane through the moment. Cole fed slack to the downhill carriers, then drew it back in tiny tugs so the sled never swung. They advanced 1 boot length, then another, until the ground widened and forgiveness returned. They could smell diesel and hot canvas now. The rope line drew into focus between palms. Ghost kept discipline. He guided them through the last tight turn and stopped at the line waiting for the first carrier to step over before he crossed. Cole refused the relief that ruins ankles at the finish. Same speed to the horses, he said, meaning the sawhorse stands under the Holt walked the head in, eyes on Kane. The litter settled into the cradle with a controlled thump. Holt kept his hand on the strap until the table owned the weight, then peeled a glove and checked skin again. Color better, breathe steady, ribs angry, arms stable, mind clear. We're through the worst, he said, because the dog had made belief rational. Cole crouched and put his palm on Ghost's shoulder, the closest he came to ceremony. You wrote the map, he said. Ghost shook water in a glittering arc and sat within reach of Kane's good hand. Kane's fingers found wet fur and stayed there. Around them, the compound returned to louder logic, radios, zippers, but a seam of awe held. The trail behind still glistened in memory with marks on bark and root, a path stitched by patience and read by men willing to be led. Extraction complete, the jungle closed its jaws behind them, and the team knew skill had carried weight, but precision had carried the day. The jungle thinned into crooked silhouettes where the compound's edge burned orange against wet leaves. Ghost walked point because no one carried a better map than the one under his pads. He paused at each hinge in the ground, tasted the humid wind and chose lines that spared ankles and tempers. Behind him the litter moved level in practiced hands. Kane lay strapped and warm beneath a blanket, eyes open, breath steady enough to answer discipline. Kane managed to obedience. Holt kept a palm on the chest strap to feel every rise through nylon, counting rhythm while he scanned footing. Cole drifted along the file like a plumb line given boots, voice low and exact whenever the trail pinched. Voices from the perimeter floated through trees. Zippers, a generator's cough, the clink of a mug set down twice. Heads turned as the line broke from green into clearing. Men who had seen hard things stopped seeing anything except the gray dog trotting point like a guide who knew the address by heart. Ghost slowed near the rope, waited for the front carrier to step, then crossed as if clearing a threshold. He scanned tents, comms table, sawhorses under tarp, then pivoted to the medical entrance and held, chest forward, ears pricked. The team followed his angle, same spacing to the med tent, Cole said without raising his voice. Boots adjusted, the litter floated rather than jolted. A seam of relief ran down the line. Holt checked Kane's pupils on the edge of light, noted color returning to lips. Home, he said, a ledger entry more than a whisper. Thanks to the quiet one, Kane answered. Ghost rose and walked beside the head of the litter so Kane could see his shoulders and keep time with them. Inside, the medical tent smelled of disinfectant fighting wet jungle. Lamps burned amber against damp canvas. Holt directed the landing like choreography, on 3 down, pause, lines, pressure, pulse. Tasks arrived in breath-long packets and happened on time. Cole kept talking outside and let the tent become the calm that the rest of the compound borrowed. A trainee paused, stared at Ghost, then remembered to move. Someone in back muttered, "That's stray," and someone else said, "Not today." Kane's vitals settled under steady heat, ribs banded, forearms secured, warm air turning damp into comfort, water offered in careful sips. Holt's posture shifted from fight to guard. He looked at the dog and let admiration become policy. "He stays," he said to the room, aiming the sentence at anyone ready to test it. Policy met procedure at the flat. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett arrived like a rule in boots, clipboard under her arm, uniform creased with the clean line between field and office. She took in the dog, the litter, the orange tape tied to Holt's belt, the mud, the order inside the mess. Her features did not harden, they settled. "Why is an unregistered animal in the medical zone?" she asked, tone even, as if requesting a time hack. Cole shifted half a step, anchoring without looming. "He led the extraction," he said. "He also found the patient." Holt added, "He provided heat, blocked the slide and marked egress. He remains part of the treatment plan until we say otherwise." Bennett's pen hovered over a form. "Policy requires quarantine and verification before any animal enters the perimeter," she said. "He goes to holding while we confirm identity, vaccination status and chain of custody." Ghost did not move, he had already chosen his post. Close enough to the cot to hear the breath he had guarded in the ravine, far enough not to crowd hands. Kane watched Bennett with tired amusement. "Ma'am," he outranked panic, he said. A few heads angled away to hide small smiles. Bennett did not rise to it. "I am not here to diminish what occurred," she said. "I am here to ensure what follows does not compound risk." "Risk was managed by competence," Holt said, pointing with 2 fingers at sling, band, heater vent and dog. "You are looking at one of the most competent assets under this roof." "Asset is a formal designation," Bennett replied. "It requires paperwork and authority you do not possess." "Authority belongs to Commander Reed," Cole said, still even. "He will be briefed, and until then the dog remains here under my responsibility and the medical office." Bennett weighed the words, then the room, then the patient whose breath had evened under warm fabric. She considered the dog who had not barked, had not begged, had not moved without purpose, since she walked in. "Interim measure," she said at last. "Animal stays here, no roaming, no contact beyond medical necessity. I will notify Commander Reed immediately." "Understood," Cole said. Holt nodded once and returned to the checks. Bennett stepped aside, not defeated, not persuaded, simply aware that the next decision belonged to a higher desk. Outside, sunset bled along the jungle's teeth. Men stood in ones and twos, trading short sentences that became unit memory. Ghost scratch marks on bark were already waypoints. One carrier traced a root seam and said, "He made me trust dirt again." Another answered, "He made me trust patience." Inside, Holt keyed the radio. "Medical requests Commander Reed at Tent 1, patient stabilized, disposition required." Bennett heard the call and inclined her head. "Commander Reed will determine disposition," she said, shifting the matter from policy to command. Until then, comply with interim limits. Cole accepted the boundary because it kept the door open. He will not be separated from Kane tonight. Nor from me while I am on shift, Holt added. Bennett wrote an interim note in a neat, decisive hand. Kane reached his good hand. Ghost leaned so palm met fur. The lines on Kane's face eased in a way morphine never quite managed. Good work, he said. Not sentiment but rank, granted, where it belonged. Ghost blinked slowly and settled with his chest against the cot's metal leg, like a brace where wood meets stone. Holt tucked a blanket corner and watched the last of the day's adrenaline drain from Kane's shoulder. The tent felt an inch wider. Lieutenant, Holt said without challenge, you are welcome to watch the next round of vitals. She stepped forward and did so, seeing color hold, pulse ease, breath deepen. Ghost changed nothing except the margin by which stability held. The scene argued for him without rhetoric, a team that had listened to the ground, a medic who trusted his eyes, a senior NCO who kept fear from setting tempo, and a dog who had walked point without orders. The orange rim of sun thinned to embers at the tree line. Voices dimmed outside. The generator settled into a steady hum. Ghost closed his eyes without sleeping, as if rest itself could be a guard post. Respect arrived ahead of paperwork. Tension did not vanish, only relaxed into a shape men could live with. In that quiet, the compound learned a new arrangement of truths. Rules matter, judgment matters, and sometimes the most precise professional in the room does not carry a serial number. The night would begin with those facts and wait for the command to catch up. The medical tent worked like a steady machine as evening thickened and humidity glued canvas to poles. Lamps threw warm circles over trays, labels and the silver lines of instruments. Radio murmurs threaded through the fabric walls with the soft insistence of a tide. Kane lay propped on the cot, color returning in careful tones, ribs bound and arms secured, eyes clearer than the hour suggested. Holt kept a quiet vigil with one hand on the blanket edge, charting numbers he already knew by feel, checking breath, skin and pulse with the economy of habit. Ghost lay at the cot's steel leg, chest pressed to metal, listening to everything without moving unless movement mattered. Bennett hovered near the supply rack with a clipboard and a set jaw, her gaze returning to the gray dog as if pulled and resisted at once. Humid air tasted of antiseptic and leaf rot. Order made a bridge across the swamp of fatigue. Commander Isaac Reed stepped in with rain freckling his jacket and a leather folder under his arm. He did not raise his voice, he didn't need to. He swept the scene once, saw the patient's color, the medic's readiness, the senior NCO's calm line, the lieutenant's rigid poise and the dog's vigilant stillness. Report, he said. And Holt gave it in stripped sentences. Found by the dog stabilized on a failing slope. Extraction along marks the dog made. Safe arrival, vitals improving. Reed nodded once and opened the folder. The photo on top showed the same animal months younger. Coat smoother. Gaze fixed on a handler's glove. The caption line read, MWD-20. Training notes marched in tidy blocks. Obedience, tracking, explosives, patrol. Stamped and initialed. The page turned to absence. Bennett cleared her throat. Sir, policy requires quarantine and verification before an animal is allowed in medical spaces. Reed held her eyes for a beat, not to admonish but to steady the surface. Policy protects us, he said. He knelt, ignoring the damp floor, and tipped Ghost's chin with 2 fingers to read the tattoo inside the ear. He compared scars to notes with the fast accuracy of a man who has learned to respect detail. 214, he said, almost to himself. Ghost, the name settled the space the way a right word can. The dog did not lean in or pull away. He waited for the next task. Kane's voice carried a dry rasp that still managed gratitude. Sir, he found me and would not let the hill finish the job, Holt added. He braced, warmed, marked and led. Without noise. Cole said nothing and said enough by the way his boots planted. Bennett's pen stopped above the form like a helicopter on a hover. Reed stood, flipped to a blank page, and wrote with a pressure that impressed through the paper. Status reinstated. Unit, SEAL Team 8, Handler Provisional Medical, until assignment. Housing attached to the compound. Access permission needed. He initialed, signed and dated. That put ceremony to the act. The authority lived inside the handwriting. Cole tapped his thigh once. Ghost rose, stepped forward, and sat exactly out of the way. Reed placed his palm briefly on the dog's shoulder, not a pat, but recognition. "Welcome back to the roster," he said. "We failed your paperwork. You didn't fail your training." Outside, word moved faster than rain. Men drifted to the entrance and stilled without piling in. Cole lifted his voice a fraction. "Detail, form up." Boots found a half circle that left lanes for care. Holt shifted a monitor lead. Bennett moved the clipboard aside, and the room chose a kind of stillness that could hold meaning. Reed faced the group. "Team," he said. "A military working dog lost his handler and slipped through a crack. Today he found our missing man, steadied him when the ground said no, and guided the litter across hazards that would have broken speed. I have read his record and seen the work with my own eyes. MWD 2140 is reattached to this command as Ghost." He lifted his hand in a deliberate salute. Others followed as if a tide had turned. Holt with shoulders squared despite sweat and fatigue. Cole with a nod that tightened lines into respect. Bennett, reluctant yet honest, bringing her palm up because facts had left no room for pretense. Ghost did not mimic posture. He watched Kane breathe and accepted the air's new shape. Applause never came. It would have been wrong. The recognition was a chord struck clean and allowed to ring. "Sir, I will begin re-entry paperwork tonight. He will need gear, a bed, a veterinary check and access control." Reed nodded. "Use the south pen and cut the dead lock. Put a bed in this corner until he is comfortable. He sleeps where his patient is until transfer." "Cole, assign a watch to learn his signals." Cole answered, "Already have 2 names." Holt crouched beside Ghost. "You're with us," he said, and the dog blinked slowly, head resting against the cot leg again. The gesture quiet and sufficient. The tent returned to movement without spilling the layer of reverence that had settled. Zip ties whispered. The kettle clicked, a zipper purred, and orders traveled in low voices. Reed closed the folder as if the leather itself deserved care. 214, he said once more, tasting the number like a returned compass point. "Ghost, you earned back what should never have been taken." He turned to the men at the flap. "Write this into muscle memory. When speed lies, choose precision. When the map fails, follow the honest line. When a quiet partner offers the right answer, believe him." Heads dipped. The lesson would outlive the storm. Bennett stepped to the table, already building a list that would make the exception lawful. Vaccination confirmation, tag issue, kennel refurbishment, gate permissions, handler rotation, emergency protocols. She did not sound defeated. She sounded convinced by the evidence. Kane's hand found an ear and scratched the notch left by an old fight. The dog leaned a fraction, and then went still, attention on the rise and fall under the blanket. Holt updated the chart, temperature even, pulse steady, respiration smooth, pain controlled, and added a line he had never written before, and did not intend to erase morale high. Outside, sunset pushed orange across puddles and turned ropes into glowing lines. Inside, the air grew easier to breathe. Reed checked his watch in the door. "I'll brief higher," he said. "If anyone asks what happened, tell them the truth. A working dog held a line until the rest of us could grab." He touched Ghost's shoulder one last time, and walked out into the damp light, leaving the leather folder on the table, because the contents had already moved into practice. Bennett followed to call the kennel. Cole stepped out to set the watch. Holt stayed because that was his post. The salute did not vanish with Reed's shadow. It lived on in smaller gestures. A trainee rerouted a hose because the dog lay there. A sentry adjusted his route to pass the pen. A cook asked which ration bin held canine chow, and got an answer with a grin. The compound bent around a fact and returned to it. Ghost kept his post with the same patient focus he had carried into the ravine, neither demanding nor apologizing for space. "Who's a hero you wish got more recognition?" Share below. In that humid evening, recognition meant a name back on a roster, a bed placed where watchful eyes could do their work, and a team choosing to remember what had almost been lost. We will carry that truth into every lane tomorrow together. Night eased over the compound until canvas rope and palm fronds turned to careful silhouettes. Inside the medical tent, lamps cast warm circles on stainless trays and coiled tubing while a kettle ticked on a quiet burner. Lucas Kane lay propped on pillows, ribs wrapped, left arm secured, color returning where shock had washed it away. His breath moved the blanket in a steady rise and fall he could trust. Beside the cot, chest set against the steel leg like a brace, Ghost rested with his chin on Kane's good hand, eyelids low, ears awake. The jungle's wet breath pressed at the seams, but the space felt held, as if loyalty had become a physical thing that kept weather where it belonged. Elias Holt studied the chart the way a carpenter checks a joint by sight, by touch, by the feeling that numbers confirm rather than create. Temperature even, pulse regular, skin warm. He wrote the readings, then watched the small things that mattered more. The eased line of Kane's jaw, the loosened shoulders, the rhythm that matched the dog's calm. "How's the pain?" Holt asked. "No longer driving," Kane said. Ghost lifted his head at the word, listened to the tent, then settled again so Kane's fingers could find the scar along his ear. The generator hummed like a lullaby. Someone outside set a mug down twice. The night's business found quieter gear. Commander Isaac Reed pushed through the flap with rain bright on his sleeves and a leather folder tucked under one arm. He didn't bring noise, he brought completion. "You look less like a cautionary tale," he said. Holt half rose, then stayed where the job was. Reed opened the folder. 14 months, he read. NIMWD Tung, handler killed during redeployment. Status lost in transit. Training scores remain exemplary. He looked at Ghost and then at Kane. Names matter, he has one again. He set the folder on the table and tapped a line he had written earlier. Status reinstated. Unit SEAL Team 8. Provisional handler. Medical until assignment. Housing attached to compound. Access per mission need. He sleeps at the South Pen when he chooses it. Bed here when duty puts him bedside. The sentence reset the room. Holt let out a breath he hadn't admitted he was holding. Kane scratched the notch in Ghost's ear with his good hand. "You kept the hill from taking what wasn't owed." Ghost didn't preen. He watched breath and posture as if patience itself were a task. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole appeared in the doorway with a small nod. "South Pen is clear. New bed in the corner," he said. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett stepped beside him. "Clipboard neat. A set of tags sealed in plastic. Documentation is caught up," she said, voice free of earlier friction. "Gate permissions, chow schedule, vet chain, access control." She set the tags down like coins paid toward an old debt. Outside, the jungle slid from green to blue. Inside, the tent became a classroom that didn't need a blackboard. Holt poured water into a bowl. Ghost waited until Kane's fingers left his chin before rising. He ate a measured portion from a fresh bag and returned to his post without asking anyone to make room. His chest found the leg. His breathing matched the metronome under the blanket. Kane felt the steadiness and let his own breath answer. 14 months, Holt said. More to the night than to anyone. He kept training as if inspection might happen any second. Reed answered. Inspection did happen. The grader wore mud. Bennett looked at the dog and then at the roster. "I argued policy to prevent new problems," she said. "Tonight the policy learned a name. I'll make it true on paper." She placed the tags on the table like small coins paid toward a debt. Men and women came in ones and twos offering the kind of help that never asks for thanks. A dry towel, a folded blanket, a fresh set of leads, a grin aimed at the floor. A trainee asked, "Sir, will he walk?" Cole said, "When terrain lies and sound deceives, we will ask his opinion first." Reed added, "And we will pay for it with rest, vet care and respect." Kane closed his eyes and saw scratch marks on bark, a turned paw over false footing, a quiet body blocking a slide. "I know who I trust when the ground argues," he said. Hours softened, the playlist near comms turned to instrumentals, a kettle sighed. Holt checked vitals in a rhythm that felt like a vow, not a chore. Ghost slept in slices, never entirely. Each time a new footfall changed the tent's tone, he rose, listened, and returned to contact. The new bed waited in the corner under a folded blanket, bowl shining. He ignored it because his post was here. Reed lifted the folder again, more ceremony than need. "We'll brief this into doctrine," he said. "Precision over speed, patience over display. Trust is earned one small proof at a time. Training lanes will teach it. The after-action report will record it. The roster will carry his name so the next watch knows who they're looking at. Bennett scribbled notes that turned sentiment into protocol. Gate permissions, chow schedule, vet chain, gear issue, handler rotation, quiet hours, emergency triggers. Kane raised his head a fraction. I want him beside us when the map disagrees with the ground, he said. I want him at the front when the path looks honest and isn't. Reed said, granted within reason, we will preserve what makes him valuable judgment and refusal. Cole drummed the doorframe, content. We'll build rest into the plan and treat his signals like order. Holt squeezed Kane's shoulder. He'll keep watch. Night deepened until the generator's hum felt like a lullaby. A sentry paused at the flap and saluted the small arrangement of truths. Man healing, medic steady, officer approving, dog on guard. No one corrected him. Holt logged another clean set of numbers. Kane said, I'm not where I was. Holt answered, that's what work is for. Reed looked at Ghost one more time. You kept our promise to each other, he said. We train so that the day can't steal anyone we can still. He touched Kane's blanket and the folder and turned toward the flap. Sleep. Tomorrow we make this lesson muscle. Kane turned his face toward the gray muzzle and spoke the kind of thanks that stick. You're my partner now, he said. Quiet as a promise. Holt nodded because the word had finally landed where it belonged. Cole tugged the flap aside and let the night breeze rinse heat, then looked back at the cot the way a man looks at a standard he intends to keep. Bennett clipped final papers to the board and, with a small, sincere smile, set a stainless bowl by the new bed. Reed's voice closed the circle. 14 months unclaimed. Still ready when it counted. That's not luck. That's loyalty meeting duty. Kane rested his palm on Ghost's head, and felt a contented weight lean into the touch. The dog's eyes slid half shut, posture calm in the way of someone who already knows the answer. Around them the compound settled into that rare state where hard places feel on. Nobody needed a speech to understand what had changed. A name returned, a place secured, a lesson learned. The team would carry it into lanes and briefings, into drills and quiet watches, into the next storm that tried to turn patience into hurt. If Ghost's loyalty moved you, hit like, subscribe and share. Comment, would you trust a dog like Ghost to save you? Check out more canine stories on screen now. Tonight.